everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Troubleshooting Meraki Hybrid Networks. My name is Eden, and I'm here on the marketing team at Sunset Learning. Raymond is here with me, and he will be your instructor today. Raymond has worked for and consulted with a variety of technology vendors for over 2 decades and has created official training certification programs for Cisco that were used around the world as part of their partner certification programs. He creates custom curriculum for a number of topics, including data center, enterprise networking, security, virtualization, collaboration, data analytics, and has enjoyed writing and teaching about Meraki solutions since its acquisition by Cisco in 2012. Before we get started, I have a few poll questions. If you could take a minute to answer those.
My only regret is I can't vote on that poll, but everyone else can. So please go ahead and answer that.
All right, I'll go ahead and end this one and share the results for you. So pretty good variety.
Yeah, it's interesting to see 37% are considering Meraki. So you're here to learn a little bit about what that integration might look like possibly. So that's encouraging to see that. Thank you if you're not yet fired up in Meraki. Hopefully we can answer some of your questions and get you on board with it. Yeah, and this particular poll question is just to get a sense of, the rough distribution of networks through your organization. A lot of companies are deploying Meraki in incredibly large numbers of locations, depending on the kind of organization they are. Retail stores, for example, do that a lot. Schools do that a lot. And of course, there's other smaller companies that have a small number, 1, 2, or 3 locations. So we're kind of interested to see what that distribution looks like here. And if you're curious if there's places that have more than 50 locations, there absolutely are quite a few clients with, and there you have it there. So about 14% of you have 50 or more locations. So a lot of people are surprised when they see kind of the scope and scale of Meraki deployments. And it's not a big surprise to see about 2 to 10 being a fairly solid number, about 27% of you. That's pretty expected that about a third of you would have shown up at around that size. Very popular for people that have a small network and be running Meraki on it. But I love to see also that we have very large networks running Meraki too. So it just shows you kind of the scope that Meraki is capable of. And of course, about 1/3 of you, which is very close to what was the number of people who had not yet implemented Meraki. So all of this is great numbers. Thank you for sharing that detail.
Yeah.
And is that it? Do you have any more polls, or was that just those 2?
One more.
One more? All right. Oh, here we go. Notice that this is the only one where you can pick more than one answer. It's where are you having trouble right now with Meraki? So, and it doesn't mean, of course, that Meraki is challenging. It just means that, there's a lot of things going on in our environments, and we need to get a handle on that and make sure we've got it under control. If I were to make a prediction, I'm going to make a prediction. Wi-Fi is going to be number 1. Let's see what happens when we get the poll answers here. You probably see the answers developing. I don't see anything in terms of. You do. So you already know. Okay. So are you ready to bet the house here?
Yep. I'm gonna.
It's either that or client. It's client is all encompassing, but Wi-Fi tends to be one of the biggest challenge areas, and that's kind of across the board. Quite honestly, it doesn't really matter what vendor you're talking about.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it and share the results.
I'm ready. Let's go.
We'll see if his prediction was right. There's actually a tie.
I won. It's a tie between Wi-Fi and security. I think
that
all
really close together. They're all very close.
Actually, that is actually fascinating. So really, the message here is kind of we need help across the board, is what I'm getting here. When I look at this, for those 3 of you who said that you have other issues, go ahead and put in maybe in the chat window, just drop a little note about what that issue is, because that's fascinating me. And obviously there are a lot of other areas that we could be having challenges with, but I really want to know. Oh yeah, QoS. Sure. Good choice, Jeff. I probably should have included that one in the main list. Yeah, really good. Oh, is my connection breaking up? Yeah. So to explain this to everyone, I'm actually in Indonesia right now. I was in Bali a couple days ago. I'm in an island called Lombok is where I am now. And I'm on a dedicated connection that the resort provided me. But, I might be shooting through satellite. I'm honestly not sure what way this is routing off to you guys. But keep me in the loop if it's breaking up massively. And also try to, not talk too fast and repeat a little bit, just in case a word breaks up, you'll be able to hear me. And
Thank
my
you,
son's
yeah.
at here. Yeah, you guys will keep me honest. If it gets really bad, let me know.
Yeah, we definitely will. Thanks for answering those poll questions. That was really helpful for all of us to see where you guys are at with Meraki. And I'll hand it over to Raymond to get started.
Perfect. Appreciate it. So thanks everyone for spending some time here to talk about Meraki, hybrid Meraki, and troubleshooting. It really is a very large, area or topic to cover. We've got about an hour. We'll do what we can. It's going to be a big high-level introduction. I want to explain what I mean by hybrid first, and then we'll kind of talk about troubleshooting in the routing, switching, and wireless domains, which are some of the most popular domains. And, if I can throw in a little bit of the security pieces, I mean, it really looks like almost anything I can talk about is going to be relevant to someone here tonight. So I'll try and cover off what I can in the time that we've got available. But those at least were the three main ones that I kind of knew people would want to talk about. Now, you've already kind of answered this one, so I'm not going to ask you to do it again. It's really, what were some of the challenging areas that you had in troubleshooting Meraki? And honestly, that last poll question gave me a good idea of what that looks like. So just, keep that in mind as we go through this very first introductory slides. I don't really have any salesy slides here at all. The only reason I have this particular slide is simply just to, let everyone know that the Meraki ecosystem is massive. The number of clients, the number of networks, the number of devices. There's an incredibly large ecosystem now built on top of Meraki. And, that's why we need to talk about troubleshooting and make sure that everyone's following best practices, and also so that you're not alone, and that there's probably people like you who are having challenges of the same nature. And in many cases, we have solutions to a lot of those challenges. It's just the word hasn't really gotten out yet. And of course, one of the big reasons that challenges arise is a lot of customers are integrating Meraki with other stuff. So hybrid networking, basically. And, while we prefer that it be Cisco stuff that you're integrating, or Cisco Enterprise, maybe that's a better phrase, which Cisco Enterprise is the traditional command line driven enterprise networking gear. And so, it's pretty obvious that there's going to be a really large number of customers that are going to mix and match Cisco Enterprise with Cisco Meraki. But in my own experience of teaching Meraki now for a decade, there's a lot of customers that are using non-Cisco gear, and they're integrating that with Meraki in certain select ways. And everybody is having challenges just because, hybrid networking is not trivial. There's a lot of, default settings that sometimes work against you, and incompatible defaults as well can cause trouble, as you all know, when you're networking. So there's a lot of kind of lessons learned over the years that we've gathered about how to properly try to run a hybrid network. And so that's one definition of hybrid, is Cisco Enterprise combined with Cisco Meraki, or Cisco Meraki combined with some other vendor. However, if you were around for Cisco Live last year, you also know that hybrid is actually been extended a little bit in terms of what it means. And there's a really interesting hybrid capability now, of course, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. I just saw, so the question was about whether or not there's a load issue recently. And it might depend on your region. It's really weird. I'm finding that it's loading really slow over here in Asia. And I'm loading up, Cisco D Cloud, for example, and things like that. And it's been really quite laggy here in Asia. So I'm curious if you're a North America only focus for the equipment that you're managing or not. But I did notice a difference as I traveled around the world. But I haven't heard of anything overall about a big issue with Meraki. So that was just a Q&A that I'm kind of dealing with up there that just popped up. So let me talk for a minute about what's been driving hybrid implementations. And this is based on again, all the people I work with, all the people like you who, come to me and talk about the challenges and issues they have. This is how Meraki shows up. Meraki shows up when they're rolling out a branch office and they want to keep the IT overhead really light at the branch office. And so they choose Meraki for the branch, even though they might have Cisco Enterprise in their main locations. And it's obvious reasons. It's so easy to deploy remote offices with Meraki. It's so easy to manage those offices. You don't need to have a heavy IT presence in order to do it. So there's just a lot of benefits of deploying Meraki. But of course, the minute they do that, they're instantly into a hybrid scenario. And now they've got to start worrying. Most significantly, they start worrying about VPN connectivity, potentially SD-WAN issues rear their heads quite quickly when they go for that type of hybrid deployment. And to the extent that they're not familiar with Meraki, simply just a transition to cloud managed versus command line managed, that in and of itself creates a lot of challenges for many companies. The same kind of thing happens when they're expanding their business, and it may not necessarily be a branch office. They may in fact be expanding headquarters, but they're thinking that they want to take a new direction and they want to start looking at Meraki to help them do that. And they might even on the same prem start mixing some Meraki gear with a Cisco Enterprise gear. Or they might be considering expanding just a component of their network, like the Wi-Fi component. And then they think, well, why don't we just switch over completely to Meraki as our access point solution, and we'll keep Cisco Enterprise for everything else. And that's been happening quite frequently as well. So those are some really prominent reasons why we end up with hybrid networks. Acquisitions, mergers, a change of IT strategy, either led at the top or potentially if you get a refresh in staff, sometimes the staff that comes in has a preference for cloud managed infrastructure and they tend to move the company over towards that when they onboard. Or it just may be that you're looking for additional capabilities which are more easily found in the Meraki ecosystem at a price point and complexity that suits you better. And you just decide that maybe Meraki is a better fit for you. And then you begin the slow transition off of your traditional enterprise portfolio into maybe a Meraki dominated portfolio. And again, these are stories that I'm hearing from customers like you about why they're moving over to Meraki. As of July last year, another reason that has come up, and here, let me go to this slide. Another reason that's come up as of July last year was the introduction of integrated management for the Cisco Catalyst family in the Meraki dashboard. You may or may not have been there for Cisco Live in Vegas back in July, but it was one of the big announcements that they made. And there's kind of two flavors of it. There's a monitoring only flavor where you can configure your Catalyst switches, for example, so that they can be monitored from the Meraki dashboard. And that will give you situational awareness, but it won't give you the ability to manage those Catalyst switches. And then the second flavor of the integration is a swap out of the operating system on the Catalyst switch into a version of an operating system that's compatible with the Meraki dashboard. And in doing that swap out, you now bring those Catalyst switches under direct management, as well as monitoring of the Meraki dashboard. And that's a significant step forward. It obviously requires a significant change in the OS on the switch itself in order to achieve that. And it's designed for customers that, like the feature functionality, price point of the Catalyst family switches, but they also like the dashboard managed or cloud managed capabilities of Meraki. And they're simply looking to bring the best of those two worlds together. And this is certainly one of the ways that they can absolutely do that. And so this is a little bit more modern version of the hybrid network, because it really implies full manageability and at the very least full monitoring capability of a traditional Catalyst portfolio in combination with the Meraki portfolio. And that's a really interesting direction that customers are starting to move in, or at least they're starting to experiment with these particular modes. Now, for me personally, in the chat window, if there's anyone here who's currently doing that or looking at doing that, I'd really be interested to know that. I think you have the ability in the chat to communicate with everybody. And so just drop a note in there if you're actually looking at this particular form of hybrid. And while you're doing that, I'm looking at a little comment here from Zaya. Let's see. Yeah. Happy sec. Yeah, Meraki. So let me give you a sense for some sizes, so the question that Zayed is asking, which everyone can see, it's really founded on scalability. Is fundamentally, well, scalability and features, quite honestly, right, is what that question is founded on. There are school systems in the US that are operating in excess of 40,000 Meraki devices in their network. To give you some idea of the scale, right? The number of devices that some companies are actually have under management with Meraki. There's also a number of large global enterprises that have deployed Meraki at all of their data centers on a global basis and use Meraki infrastructure end to end to help support the management, administration, monitoring of the data centers. Now, to be really clear, the data center is also going to have more traditional data center infrastructure within it as well. So the Nexus switches and all that other stuff is going to be there. But there's the management layer on top of this to help them control all the telemetry and the cameras and the other components and the IP collaboration platforms and all of that management layer, if you will. That's actually delivered on Meraki, which is layered over their data center infrastructure on a global basis. And so that's the closest example I could come up with where we are dealing with data center deployments. We're dealing with multicast traffic, obviously, in addition to the unicast traffic in that environment. Lots of VMs end-to-end throughout this environment, lots of devices, lots of locations. And if I remember correctly, hub and spoke was a topology, although honestly, I'd have to double check against that one to be perfectly sure. So that's a closest example I can come up with where they're doing something like what you're asking for, Ziad. So hopefully that's helpful to you. That particular customer has 12,000 Meraki devices under management on a, well, at least at the time, it was probably more now, but 12,000 devices under management at the time. So I think you get an idea, right, for what's going on out there. Yeah. So, I'm laughing, right? I'm laughing because Sashin asked me for a competitive scorecard for Cisco traditional versus Meraki. I actually don't have that in pocket. You know, the way that we typically begin that conversation with customers is it's generally more important to find out their attitude towards cloud managed versus on-prem managed. I think that's probably the most important top line question that you want to ask, and just figure out where they are, because honestly, if they're not open to cloud-based management, it doesn't matter what the feature card has got on it. Because there's completely different criteria, right, that they're using here. If you get a customer who says, well, I'm open to it, just tell me the features, I'll make up my mind. I'm a little concerned about that answer, quite honestly, because it seems to me that they need to really have a position about cloud versus on-prem. And what starts to come up when you talk about cloud, is specifically say for wireless, which is your subject matter, is, you have a cloud-based controller. Right, it's effectively a distributed cloud-based controller. It scales to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of access points It's incredibly easy to expand, grow, manage, control, maintain. It certainly simplifies incredibly large deployments because of the cloud managed nature of it. And that in and of itself is actually a fairly significant advantage. And it's worthwhile a pretty lengthy discussion just around that, say, versus a controller-based deployment and all the other challenges. If there were something that would come into that picture at scale that you also need to really dive into is have a good understanding of roaming and what it is that they want to do with respect to client roaming and what the scenarios are that they're looking to support, and maybe even a little bit about the applications that they're trying to support with seamless roaming, because there can be some variations in there where, there's a lot of stuff the Meraki cloud can do, but fundamentally the command line driven on-premises based controller architectures have got decades worth of features that have been cooked in to support every imaginable application. And I can certainly foresee a couple of scenarios where there just might be better support for those applications in the on-prem world versus, say, a cloud-based controller world. So that's down the rabbit hole a lot to have that kind of conversation with them. But it only makes sense to have it if they've decided their philosophical perspective and you really want to figure out what that is, cloud versus on-prem. So, yeah, but it's a good question, and I certainly understand why you're asking that. So I hope I helped you get a little bit around that. So maybe we should have just made this presentation a Q&A session and just had set up a whole hour of me answering this. And I'm going to go on to my slides in just a minute. Yeah, big campus, hardware stacking, SDP, east-west traffic. Yeah. Although MSTP might actually be helping you a little bit with some of the traffic security on the stretch VLANs. We'd have to see. I'd have to look into that a little bit. And you're right, the whole spanning tree, PVST, RSTP integration is there, of course, but there's a lot of rules around how we get RSTP to behave properly with things like multi-spanning tree as well. And that's definitely one of the areas that people have a lot of trouble with. Yeah, right? Yeah. Did you do a single domain MSTP, or are you actually doing multiple? Like, are you truly taking advantage of the multi-spanning trees? Because in most modern design architectures, the trees collapse anyway into a common tree. So yeah, exactly. You do one instance. So that works quite nicely in the Meraki world. And it actually solves some of the security VLAN leakage issues that you could run into by doing RSTP and PVST. So good for you for moving to MSTP. Yeah, good job. Yep. So we're having conversations kind of at different levels, right? There's some people here who've maybe joined in and you're kind of like a little new to Meraki and you haven't really gone down the rabbit hole so much. And all of a sudden you heard a bunch of people and we're like halfway down a rabbit hole talking about stuff. So I can understand if you're not feeling completely in sync with some of these conversations. So I'm going to take it back up to the top level a little bit and let's help some of the people that are a little more new to Meraki get a little bit better oriented. So I'm going to use my slides to help me do that. But I do love these questions. I love that you're all really working hard to get this to work properly. So remember that this session is really just an hour, right? Where we're trying to introduce you to the fact that we acknowledge there's a lot of challenges with integration. And honestly, that's why we created the course. There's a whole 3-day course that actually stands behind this seminar. And we're going to end up talking just a little bit about that course, because honestly, I think you can probably figure it out. Even right now, you can see that it's going to be multiple days of conversation to work through all these issues that have popped up. Just in the Q&A alone, there's multiple days of things that we probably should talk about. And, if you are looking to come away from the seminar knowing what you were going to do next, it's not a horrible thing to look at that 3-day class, to really sit and spend the time that it takes to go through all of these kinds of issues. But like I said earlier, I want to kind of come up at a little bit of a higher level to help people that are maybe a little bit more new to the Meraki world just for a second. So here's a real simple orientation that everybody can understand when it comes to the world of hybrid. This diagram is, you're probably tired of it. It's the classic campus architecture diagram, right? Core, distribution, access layer type of topology. We've got our access points connected in to that access layer. And, this is the world that many of us live in day to day. And what is happening with a lot of customers is they're choosing specific pieces of this topology, and they're already operating Cisco Enterprise. And then they start thinking to themselves, hey, you know what? This is really a great time for us to maybe, look at the MRs from Meraki, and maybe we should swap out our access points, and maybe we're going to convert over to the MRs, and that's going to be a project. And we'll keep everything else the same. We don't need to change a thing. And that's a really common approach, by the way, to kind of entering into a hybrid Meraki environment. Another kind of pathway to hybrid that we see a lot is at the edge of the network, customers start looking at the Meraki MX as a potential edge device. And this is going to give them, of course, security, firewall, IPS types of capabilities. It's going to give them VPN capabilities, IPsec VPN capabilities. And it's also going to give them SD-WAN. And again, it's going to be a Meraki specific SD-WAN, but it's a really easy to implement SD-WAN. And so we see a lot of customers who start deploying MXs at the edge, and they're deploying it for all of the reasons I've given you. SD-WAN is a particularly strong factor in that deployment for some customers, and it might in fact be the leading reason why they do it. And I've also seen another really interesting strategy. And let me just clean this up a little bit so that I can really emphasize how different that is. And I'll just kind of hit that button. So the other strategy I've seen is a customer has an existing firewall infrastructure or, a routed infrastructure here. And what they do is they get either a Cisco device like Viptela or maybe, a third-party device, and they implement SD-WAN with whatever this device is. And of course, they're still maintaining their firewall or whatever, their edge device is, and they still maintain it here. And for this customer, what we've seen them do is when it comes time for them to refresh this edge device, they often look at the Meraki MX as kind of like step one. And the idea is to keep the existing SD-WAN in place, drop in the Meraki MX for the firewall, IPS, and the other capabilities. But what it does is it positions them for a future where if they wanted to divest of the SD-WAN infrastructure over on that piece and add the SD-WAN infrastructure capability on the Meraki side, it's a really straightforward deployment. They've got the MXs in place wherever they need to be. So it can be, over a couple of years where they're deploying the MXs. And then when they've got MXs everywhere, then it's feasible for them to maybe contemplate switching over to the MX as their SD-WAN provider. And they can drop one of the pieces of hardware that they're maintaining and simplify their network just a little bit. And so I've seen that as a really interesting strategy. It's very long-term, and it's typically a multi-year plan to transition off of whatever their existing SD-WAN provider is and move over to a Meraki-based SD-WAN. So that's an interesting one. And the other kind of scenario I see in terms of becoming hybrid, in most cases, it's combined with a customer who, oops, sorry, let me go back. It's combined with a customer who's already gone to the Meraki MRs. I apologize for my computer. It's not completely listening to me. There we go. So they have the MRs already in place. And what they do is they decide that they want to get greater visibility in the client troubleshooting. And one of the things that you kind of learn in the world of hybrid is that you really get excellent client troubleshooting if you convert to Meraki switches, at least at the access layer. You don't have to do it up at the distribution layer, but if you at least convert at the access layer to MSs, then the combination of this, it gives you unsurpassed end client troubleshooting capabilities. Your visibility increases tenfold easily when you do this. And so the price point's good, the feature set is good. There's lots of great reasons to consider this. And a lot of customers have done that. And they create networks that are easier to manage when they end up doing that. So that's maybe the third major way that I've seen hybrids show up. Okay. So just to give you some ideas. And again, this is also to help those of you who are a little new to Meraki. If you're thinking about what you have now and where you're going, maybe this conversation helped you a little bit in seeing what that is going to look like. And again, I'm continue to monitor the chat and the Q&A. And I especially encourage people that are new to Meraki, ask a couple questions and see if we can't give you some immediate help here during this conversation. I'm sorry, Ron. Yeah, the spanning tree loop. Yeah. And again, right, that's why, hybrid networking is not trivial. And that's why it's nice to get warnings from seminars like this about what might hurt you. And spanning tree is absolutely one of the areas that you can run into. I'm going to not cover off this slide because I've really covered off most of those points, at least the key ones I wanted to talk about. So we'll give you the slide deck as a resource. The team that's monitoring this will get you a PDF copy of this. And of course, we're recording this too. So based on lessons from clients who have converted, right, it's really important to understand what your integration goals are. Like, why are you looking at adding on, Meraki to an existing enterprise deployment? Or, why are you looking at, mixing and matching two worlds? And what is it that you want performance-wise and feature-wise and behavior-wise? It's really important to have a good idea of what that looks like. And you break it down, right, by the specific integration requirements. And this is really just a representative list, right? IPsec, VPN, get a handle on what that looks like. Your routing protocols, get a handle on what that looks like. Your security issues, traffic shaping and QoS, which is a head nod to some of you in the chat window earlier who said QoS is a big issue. You're right. You really need to think that through and know what your goals are when you're going to be creating a hybrid network. Right? Make sure your markings are being conveyed properly and are being trusted appropriately end to end throughout the network. How are you going to handle simple things like DHCP and DNS? That's important. How are you going to support your VLANs, your spanning tree protocol? We've already seen that, there's a huge amount of questions already being asked around that. And really important things that don't rise to the top of the list. How are you going to deal with user authentication? Are you going to be dealing with device authentication? How are you going to be dealing with the policy, right? The overall goals, plans, and objectives that you have, and create consistency for that end to end throughout your network. Really important questions. And then, of course, planning out what your config looks like. It's really best to test them in a sandbox somewhere to make sure that it's doing what you think it's supposed to do. Do slow rollout in a trial setting first so that you can kind of validate it and learn your lessons really quickly before you impact the entire organization. And then just roll that out and test and validate as necessary. So, it's not rocket science in the sense that, these are not mysterious things that you have to do. If there's any challenge in the planning of it that matter to the goals that you've set for your integration, that's really the biggest, most important question you have to ask yourself. So thoroughness is what you're looking for. Now, I am getting little notices from time to time that my internet connection is not completely great. So I'm hoping that it's good enough and I'm talking slow enough that it's not creating too much trouble. So top issues. On the routing side, number one, I would say, is understanding the behavior of protocols like BGP and OSPF in a Meraki context. There's a fair bit of nuance in how Meraki is implementing BGP and OSPF, and there's quite a lot of very specific rules about what is supported and what is not supported. So this will be maybe from the routing perspective, this is the first warning I will give you, is if you're depending upon OSPF or BGP at any level in your Meraki deployment, you're really going to have to study up and make sure you understand how the Meraki MX handles these protocols, how the Meraki MS handles those protocols, and how it's really quite different from how, say, a Cisco catless router is going to handle those protocols. There's a really significant set of differences in how it's handled in some of the Meraki gear. And I'll talk about that in a little tiny bit more detail coming up here, but that would be a big issue. On the switching side, spanning tree is probably the #1 issue that can rear its head when you're in a hybrid environment. And the second issue is simply the default settings on a per port basis, for example, and some of the other switching defaults, like the jumbo frame size, for example, that Meraki uses, right, which is set by default to the max value. Little things like that, those defaults can come and bite you quite quickly. Or, link access control protocol, how that functions, right, and the default behaviors of LACP, those can be things that will surprise you, potentially, depending on what it is that you're integrating with. On the wireless side, it's really the transition to cloud-based controller and just wrapping your arms around that. And combined with that would be how roaming behaves in this Meraki wireless world versus how it behaves, say, in the Cisco on-premises controller world, and making sure that you understand how to properly plan for that. That definitely comes up a fair bit. And of course, if you are going to be running a hybrid Cisco enterprise wireless, and you're going to be running Meraki wireless at the same time, and you're coexisting those two worlds in the same building, now you've got another set of challenges around how to stop them from conflicting with each other, basically, and how to deal with those SSIDs. And then finally, just as a general category, just the biggest challenge for a lot of people is the new tool set in the Meraki cloud, right? How do we manage this world? How do we monitor this world? How do we troubleshoot this world? And figuring out how to do that becomes a pretty big issue. So that's a high-level overview of where your challenges lie. And I'm keeping an eye here because I have a challenge of time, obviously. So really briefly on the Meraki MX, again, I'm gonna go right to some of the meatier stuff here, just looking at my time clock. One of the most fundamental things we learn when we're dealing with, say, a traditional Cisco iOS-based router is we learn about the different priorities of the routing protocols, and we learn that the lower the priority number, the more dominant that particular route is going to be in the routing table, right? The higher the priority it's going to have in the routing table. And so universally, a directly connected interface and the network associated with that directly connected interface, that's clearly going to be the dominant route, right, that you're going to use. And I'm using a little bit of a weird language, right? Because remember, in the Cisco iOS world, the priority value is 0. And that means that that's going to be your best route, right? Is going to be the route which has priority 0, because that means it's directly connected, right? And 1 means it's a static route, and that's going to be the next best. And so it's really weird because the language is, well, what's your highest priority? Well, your highest priority is the route that has a priority of 0. And your worst priority is the route that has a priority of 255. And so there's a disconnect, right, between the value of the number and the language that we're using. So that's why I'm using a little bit wonky, right? So your preferred route, if you will, is a little bit more neutral. So directly connected are preferred over static routes. And that's the way that it operates universally in the world of Cisco, but also in the world of Meraki, the client VPN routes. So basically, that's going to be preferred over static. And that makes a lot of sense because you don't want your client VPN pathing to be messed up. And you really want to protect that at almost all costs. And so in the world of Meraki, it's protected even more so than a static route is. So it's really interesting to see that static routes cannot interfere with your client VPN routes. And then after statics, we have auto VPNs. So these are the routes that are learned from Meraki MX to Meraki MX as they're establishing VPNs, and they're learning about the networks that are being shared on the opposite side. Those routes are being pushed into the routing table, and they're the next level of priority after static and before anything else. And that's an interesting concept. In the similar vein, non-Meraki VPN pairs will come next. And then BGP learned routes come after that. And then, of course, network address translation. Now, I want to really emphasize that specifically we're looking here at the Meraki MX as we go through this priority list. And I want you to notice that I mentioned OSPF earlier as a routing protocol that Meraki supports, but notice that OSPF is missing from the list here. And the reason that it's missing from the list, and a lot of you know already, is that the Meraki MX will support advertising OSPF routes, but it doesn't actually learn OSPF routes. So therefore, it's not in the precedence table because it doesn't actually insert OSPF routes into its routing table. Now, again, specifically Meraki MX is what we're talking about. And that's one of those little tidbits of knowledge that really important to pick up really quickly when you're dealing with that, right? We know that it will support OSPF as a full peer with a full exchange of routes and a full population of a routing table. Oh, yeah. SolarWinds. Yeah, so the question is really about automation. And so there's two answers, right? One answer is if you're already committed to a third-party package like SolarWinds, then continue with that because it'll talk to and work with the Meraki ecosystem as well. And I'm not here to talk anybody off of a tool that they've already decided on. So that's kind of my first answer is if you're using a tool, the highest probability is that it's going to continue working in the Meraki ecosystem. So, continue on, right? And then for those that are maybe not committed or looking maybe to get out or are unhappy, then I really would look more so at your own tools. So basically use the APIs and start building some of your own tools, or there's third-party companies out there that have built the tools already. My really high-level answer is, ChatGPT and its ability to help you write code has changed everything. And I'm anticipating that it's going to dramatically change what happens in the world of Cisco APIs. And I think Meraki APIs are more amiable than most to a transformation through AI-enabled coding. So I was going to write a course on programming the API, and I'm actually changing it. I'm going to write a course on how to use ChatGPT to program the API, because I think there's going to be a lot more people who are able to do that versus people who know Python from scratch. So that's a really interesting question. And my thinking on that has changed in the last month. So yeah, I'm more about APIs and using ChatGPT and those tools to write it because it's so easy to do it. I don't see why you would do anything else. And I'm not going to go into detail on this one either. I think I want to switch off of routing here a little bit and go into some of the other protocols, but I'm really just listing here some of the other considerations around BGP and OSPF. And I had mentioned already that, we don't process received routes on the Meraki MX. We only broadcast routes. And for a variety of reasons, that's how we treat OSPF on the MX. And that's a big deal to know that it happens that way. I'm going to do a demo more so around the switching and the wireless because I think that's going to be more helpful. So just hang on for a second for me to do that. So this is where when our seminar started, this is really where we jumped in very heavily. So again, for those of you that are maybe considering Meraki, so number one, I don't want you to get too worried about spanning tree. It's not as if there's something really wrong, okay, with spanning tree in Meraki. There is nothing wrong with spanning tree in Meraki. It's simply a matter of, just make sure that you've configured it appropriately for your hybrid ecosystem so you don't have bad combinations of protocols. And there are some combinations that are better than others. So the multi-spanning tree, right, MSTP with a single domain is probably one of the best solutions of integrating your traditional Cisco ecosystem with your Meraki ecosystem. It's one of the best combinations to go for. And the reason being is that the Meraki supports STP or RSTP. And it's just so that RSTP works really nicely with MSTP in a single domain. It's a really good combination. So interoperability, right, is excellent between those two protocols. They don't have to be the same protocol. Perfectly legit. with RSTP and MSTP, and that be your integration. And it's one of the best versions of it. Now you can, if you want, integrate with PVST. And the reason is that there's a lot of customers who already are running PVST. So it's just kind of dominant out there. And if it is, then that's okay too. That can integrate with RSTP. You had to be careful about VLAN 1. And I believe there was a comment a little earlier, I think it was maybe in the chat, that talked about some of the challenges that popped up when they messed around with VLAN 1, right? This is not a good thing to play with if you're trying to integrate PVST with RSTP, right? So that's one of the gotchas that you learn when you start getting into hybrid. The other thing, of course, that you need to watch for, and this is a universal thing, and it's not just about hybrid, but know who your root switch is going to be. You should never be surprised by who your root switch is. If you are ever surprised by the root switch, something's gone wrong in your configuration, because you have the ability to set the priority values for both, your primary root switch as well as the failover completely under your control. So just make sure that you know what's going on with respect to your root, manipulate your priority values as necessary so that the appropriate switches become the root bridges. And of course, these would be at the distribution layer of your campus design, right, is where that would be. Now, there have been a number of customers I've worked with that have daisy chained Meraki switches, and they've daisy chained 3 or more in a row. And as most of us know, we like having a distribution layer switch, and then we like having a direct connection to an access switch. So that's it, right? We don't like daisy chaining. We prefer that an access switch be connected to the distribution layer, and technically 2 distribution layer switches, right? That's the model. But the reality that I've run into with some of our clients is there can be physical topology issues, like a warehouse and an administrative building, and maybe there's another like section at the far end of the warehouse too. And so all of a sudden they start daisy chaining switches so that they can use copper cable, right, to kind of get where they need it to go. And they'll do that. And they'll end up with a bigger diameter than we would normally like to see them have. And in some instances, they're using fiber optic, but they're still daisy chaining, even though they've got some fiber optic in the mix as well. There's all kinds of really weird scenarios. I run into this in factories, oil refineries, right? Those kind of like big, massive facilities. They often run into more than what we would like to see in a campus. So that's really who this rule is for, about trying to keep the diameter 7 hops or less, okay? And the only other thing I would say kind of about spanning tree is double check the parameters for BPDU guard, loop guard, root guard. The defaults on the Meraki side are not necessarily the defaults that you have on your existing switches. Don't make any assumptions that certain features are enabled. Go back through the settings on your per port basis. And remember, you can use virtual switches or virtual stacks to basically create port profiles and apply those profiles across multiple ports simultaneously. So it's not too difficult if you leverage some of the features of the Meraki switches to minimize the number of configuration clicks you have to make in order to implement the appropriate spanning tree behaviors for different types of switch ports, right? So you want to leverage that. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail in the class when we do that. One thing I do want to mention is the MTU on the Meraki switches. It's going to default to 9578. So, we're automatically in jumbo frame territory on the Meraki's end of story. And there's a lot of switches out there on the enterprise side that do not default to jumbo frames. And it's an instant point of challenge, particularly if you're rolling out the Meraki switches at the access layer and they're talking to the servers and those other devices, and they're handling those big frames immediately, then they pop it up to the distribution layer, which hasn't been properly configured for jumbo frames. That's an immediate fail in terms of performance and scalability and everything else in your network environment. And you're going to notice that and have some problems with that. Lots of fragmentation, other issues. You're going to bottleneck at your distribution layer, which is a really weird place to bottleneck. So you don't want to do that. So, issues like that are going to pop up for you. So I'll kind of leave the switching high level pieces up there. I did mention earlier link access control protocol, LACP, which is, some of us call that channel bonding. Link aggregation is a little bit more formal name for this. LACP is the only supported protocol on the Meraki side, end of story, which is okay, right? Because this is going to be a standard space support, but you do want to make sure that that's what's configured on the opposite side, of course. And you do want to make sure that, ideally, really, one of the sides should be set to on as opposed to auto, because you're obviously specifically wanting to configure LACP when you've got this up and running. So you probably want to proactively configure it to be on, probably on the Cisco enterprise side. Well, not probably. On the Cisco enterprise side is where you will want to configure LACP to be on. And then the Meraki side will be auto, and it'll pick up, they'll negotiate link aggregation, and you'll be good to go at that point. So that can trip people up, configuring LACP. And of course, LACP is commonly used between the access and distribution layer to channel bond multiple gigabit links so that you get a little bit better throughput up into the distribution switches. So it's very common to implement LACP for that purposes. And of course, because the dual links then look like a single logical link from the point of view of spanning tree, which will keep both of those links open and active, right, for the bandwidth. So very important to do that. And again, I've got so much that I wanted to talk about. The slide deck will be available to you to have a look at. Let me just double check behind the scenes here. I'm going to pop over here to Safari. So I had a little trouble earlier. Maybe it's because I'm in Indonesia, and I just want to see if my network is still talking to me here or not. So I'm going to come over to a switch and see if it's alive or not. And again, this may or may not be happy with me. It was a little glitchy. It's actually one of the reasons why I ended up not really doing as much monitoring here on this side. Okay, so it looks like we've got some switches that are popping up here, and I'll maybe pick this one. So I'm kind of half randomly picking a switch here to have a look at. We're just waiting slowly to see something pop out. All right. So upper left-hand corner, we can see we're dealing with an MS425. So this is a Meraki switch. Now, I love the Meraki. So if you're one of the people that are a little newer to Meraki and you're a little curious, well, what's it going to be like managing Meraki? This dashboard is really fantastic. The information is incredible. Really briefly, your friendly name for the device, the actual device model, the MAC address value to identify the device, any problems that have been identified for that device. So instantly you've got kind of situational awareness that just pops in right away. If you kind of continue down the left-hand side, you can see critical details like IP addresses, for example, serial number, which can be important depending on what you're trying to do. We also can see that the firmware is up to date. We can see that the config is up to date. These are really important things to know that they're up to date. And I can see that it's part of a stack of switches with layer 3 routing that's been enabled on it as well. So all of this is showing us what is, the basic details that we need to know about our switch. If we are curious about the individual port status, we can see the details here, right? So the green ports obviously are active. The port with an arrow is the uplink port. It's how it communicates from a management perspective to the rest of the world. If I wanted to see more detail about what was happening, well, here we go. Then I can see the ports in detail. I can see a little bit more about what the config is. And I can, of course, click on the port, and that will show me the, the traffic that's going through the port, as well as the configuration details for the port. So I'm kind of recapping this. I know it's traditional and familiar for those of you who are already managing, which is the majority of people that are here. But I just wanted to, reach out a little bit to the people who haven't really configured Meraki yet. And I wanted to just show you how simple it is to get the basic details, which, as you know, like this is the foundation of troubleshooting, is getting an understanding of, well, how is it actually set up and what's it supposed to be doing? Or at least what do I think it's supposed to be doing? And you can get the first baseline details around that by looking at the values here for the port settings. And again, just for those people that are new, if you notice the pencil icon, if you click on that, you can actually get to the point where you can manipulate or change that. And remember when we talked about things, right? Root guard, BPDU guard, loop guard, all of those kinds of parameters, they're simply a drop-down list away from enabling them on a particular port. And you can see that this is a trunk port, and you can see that it's native VLAN 1 and it's allowing all VLANs, right? So really super easy in the Meraki world, just to double check what is currently happening. Now, from a troubleshooting point of view, obviously the status information and seeing that I had full connectivity, getting some idea of my traffic throughput, having some idea of what I'm connected to, right? So this is LLDP, which is basically telling me, well, who am I directly connected to in this particular environment? If there's anything else that might be happening here, right? I want to know about that. I can get a list of the clients that are currently have been seen connecting to this particular switch. And I can do things like, cycle ports and cable tests. Now, realistically, you're not going to run a cable test very frequently, but if you do suspect that you have a bad cable, it's nice to just run the test remotely rather than have to do a truck roll, with a ohm meter to figure out what's happening with the cables, right? In wherever this location is. So it's nice to have that remote capability. And of course, we are the classic example of power cycling a port just to see what happens. That's as old as troubleshooting. And then you can also get an idea for your packets, total counts, errors, fragments, collisions. And you can see this is a very clean cable. We really don't have much of a problem that's happening in this particular environment. So basic situational awareness is available literally at your fingertips when you're, getting into your switch to try and figure out what's happening. And just to keep it going for a little bit, if there were issues or challenges that you were concerned about, the event log is really the next place that you would come. And I do see I have a MAC address flapping a couple of different addresses, it looks like, might be flapping here, right? So that's maybe something for me to have a look at. They're all associated with VLAN 10, which is something that is of interest. And they seem to be cycling through a small group of ports. Right, there's maybe half a dozen ports or so at max, looks like, that might be involved in that. So obviously, we want to get into the bottom of this. This has been going on now for 4 or 5 days. It doesn't, about what, 6 or 7 times, about twice then. Yeah, so the 15th was active and the 17th was active for whatever this flapping was going on. So, we got a little bit of detail here. I'm not going to troubleshoot the whole thing to know exactly what's happening, but there's something going on with that I might want to look at. It might be just regular topology changes, right? It's nothing too horrible. But notice how we've got more flapping happening here too. So there's enough going on that I want to maybe dive into this a little bit. So, this is a great place to stop for if you're looking for problems or issues in your environment. And this is obviously a first stop that we can have just to figure out why we're getting so much flapping in this location. Okay. I'll pop over here to the tool side simply because classic tools like ping, which we all use for troubleshooting. If you are going to do a truck roll and you've got somebody in the building who needs to identify a switch, blinking the LEDs is always helpful to do that. Trace routes are available for you as well. You can have a look at the MAC forwarding table. So this is basically the CAM table, right? So this is the key table that the switch is maintaining for MAC addresses and where they live. And it's a core functionality of the switch is to maintain this table. But remember that the switch itself is a network attached device, and it has its own ARP table for that purpose. And so this is the ARP table, which is separate from the CAM table, right? So it's nice to have visibility into both of those tables. And of course, if I'm running a routes, and this is a routing enabled switch. So you can see the routes are showing up here quite nicely. And I can also, looks like I've got, yeah, no OSPF, but yeah, most of these are static. Yeah, see that? Interface routes and static routes. So I actually wasn't running the routing protocol. I just have a lot of VLANs basically that are connected to me, which is fine. And that's how I discover the world, right? Is all through all those connected VLANs. So, you get a very fast idea about what's visible to this device, what's reachable by this device. And these are some of the most basic things that you need to do from a troubleshooting perspective when you're working with a switch. And I noticed that I'm really just winding up here with my time as well. And yeah, always happens when the wireless user roams. Yeah, right. That makes sense, right? That there'd be a flapping with a roaming user. BTUs. I don't think there's anything that's going to stop the Meraki switches from sending BPDUs. I don't think it chokes. And this is a question in the Q&A. I had not heard of it choking on the BPDUs with that VLAN 1 removal. I'll have to double check that one and get back to you on it just to make sure. So what we've done here is, really I've taken a lot of questions from the team here, which is great. And we've had the opportunity to talk about some of the challenges that you run into with routing and with switching. And obviously, the challenges continue. There's a whole set of, interesting conversations that we can have around the Meraki MR, for example. But fundamentally, and I think there's probably no better way to make this point than what we've already done, which is there's a lot to talk about. And as fast as I tried to talk and as many questions as we tried to answer, I think everyone's realized that this is just a lot of stuff. And to do it justice, we really need to be able to, sit down for a couple of days, really work on it, get some hands-on, practice in a hybrid environment, and have a lot more time to answer the great questions like the ones you've asked. I wish I was actually in a 3-day class now with all of you, because these questions have been fantastic. And I know it would be a lot of fun to dive into them, if we had 24 hours to talk instead of just having 1 hour to talk. And again, thank you everyone for attending the session today. It really was just great to have the chance to talk to you. And I hope to have a longer chance at some point in the not too distant future. Thank you again.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.